Welcome. Hello, my name is Ashley Purpura, and I'm an associate professor of religion at Purdue University and the co-editor of the Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought book series with Fordham University Press. I would like to welcome you to this installment of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity, which is one of the many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. The Fordham Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world, broadly conceived. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We would also encourage you to follow the center on YouTube, click like on our programming, and share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. I'm joined today with our guest and featured scholar, Ina Merdjanova. Ina is a senior researcher at the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College Dublin. Her research is focused on the intersection of society, religious and cultural pluralism, nationalism, minorities, gender, conflict, and peace building, with particular reference to Eastern Europe and Turkey. She has extensive experience at various academic and research institutions around the world and has numerous book publications, most recently Rediscovering the Umma, Muslims in the Balkans Between Nationalism and Transnationalism with Oxford. And what we are here to focus on today, the edited volume, Women and Religiosity in Orthodox Christianity with our own Fordham Press out this year. Welcome, Ina.
Thank you.
So our format today is similar to what we've done in other episodes in the series. I'll start us off with some questions, and Ina and I will discuss for about 20 or so minutes, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So please do feel free to put any questions you have for our guest in the Q&A by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. The chat has been disabled for this meeting, so please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can before our time is up. So Ina, could you start us off by telling us a little bit about your background and what drives your scholarly interests?
Thank you. And let me just start by thanking also the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University for the invitation to this webinar in order to discuss my work as a scholar of Orthodox Christianity and particularly this new book. The book is a collective endeavor to describe and analyze women's experiences in selected Orthodox Christian contexts, and I need to say this, working on it was an absolutely enjoyable and rewarding experience thanks to my fantastic contributors. So, I was born and raised in Bulgaria under the communist regime, and as you might know, in my country, this regime was particularly harsh to religion. So the state marginalized, co-opted, controlled the church. It also imposed atheistic upbringing on its citizens as integral to society's modernization. So after high school, I studied philosophy at Sofia University St. Clement Ohridski for 2 years. While this was considered one of the best educations you can get in Bulgaria at that time, and I generally enjoyed studying philosophy, I did not quite like the disproportionate amount of time we spent on subjects such as dialectical and historical materialism or scientific atheism. At the time, I also wrote poetry. And yes, as a published poet, I received several literature prizes. So I got a scholarship to continue my education at the Moscow Institute for World Literature, Maxim Gorky. I was very lucky because I found myself in Russia when Gorbachev came to power and glasnost and perestroika began. It was a terrific time, a pivotal moment in history unfolding before my eyes. So witnessing and participating in this profound political and social change was a deeply transformative experience for me, both educationally and spiritually. Suddenly, churches started to reopen and the books of dissident authors, which were banned until yesterday, were freely accessible. So at the time, we had very amazing scholars and professors at the Institute, and they introduced us to Russian religious philosophy. So this is how I first read Nikolai Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, Semyon Frank, Vladimir Solovyev, and some of their books I later translated and published into Bulgarian. So when I returned from Moscow, my country was just embarking on its own road of post-communist transition. So scientific atheism was scrapped from university curricula, so I was able to enroll in a PhD program in philosophy of religion. And my dissertation focused broadly on contemporary Orthodox Christian views on human being and history. But as part of my PhD education, I spent 1 year at Oxford University, where I received specialization in theology and in sociology of religion. And where I met Father Callistus Ware, who was at that time the Dean of the Theological Faculty at Oxford. Father Callistus, I mean, this was another transformative experience, obviously. I attended his lectures, but also had numerous conversations with him. And he gave me, during one of our meetings, his book, his and Bea Sigel's book on the ordination of women in the Orthodox Church, and told me how this book is a result of his own evolution in thinking about the issue of ordination of women in the Orthodox Church. And the book inspired me to think more deeply of the different roles and experiences of men and women in the Church. I later translated this book into Bulgarian and published it in Bulgaria. And I had also a memorable meeting with Elizabeth Bea Sigel at the Congress of the Western Europe's Orthodox Fraternity in France in 2002. After graduation, my academic career led me away from theology to sociology of religion, and my research has focused on both Islam and Orthodox Christianity in Southeast Europe and Turkey, in addition to interreligious dialogue, religious and cultural pluralism, minorities, gender, conflict, and peace building. So therefore, my position is one of critical reflexivity regarding my own religious tradition.
Thank you. That's so interesting that I mean, you've covered so much from poetry, philosophy of religion, and then moving into more sociological, kind of ethnographic and political interests as well. It's really quite interesting to hear about that journey. I wonder if you might now tell us a little bit about what led you to this book specifically, to put together the volume Women and Religiosity and Orthodox Christianity, and a little bit about what you hope its impact might be, if that impact is on the field, you know, scholarship, or in the church perhaps as well.
Yes, I have been thinking about this volume for a very long time before I started working on it. My participation as a senior fellow at the Orthodoxy and Human Rights Project, sponsored by Fordham University's Orthodox Christian Studies Center and funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and Leadership 100, provided inspiration and stimulus to start working on the book, but also it provided academic space for critical inquiry and exchange of ideas with an amazing team of scholars with whom I discuss draft of the book. So it is fair to say that for a long time, the social sciences failed to pay sufficient attention to Orthodox Christianity, which is obviously related to the fact that the great majority of Orthodox churches lived for decades under restrictive regimes where genuine research was off limits. So a number of studies started to appear after 1989, and they examine various aspects of Orthodox Christianity in today's world, and this somehow started to reverse this gap. But those works that appeared focused mostly on the Cold War and post-communist developments from historical, sociological, anthropological perspectives. The place and role of women, however, have largely remained understudied. So discussion on how religion and the church are profoundly gendered have generally been missing from writings on Orthodox Christianity. As I argue in my introduction to the volume, the dominant theological, historical, and sociological frameworks of the study of Orthodox Christianity have, unfortunately, remained gender blind. They have been slow to address the issues of women's rights, experiences, aspirations, even though women in the Orthodox churches typically outnumber men significantly. So the only theme that has been relatively consistently explored is the ordination of women, which has been a topic of a dozen or so theological books. So overall, the field remains underdeveloped when we compare it with the extensive sociological, anthropological, and political research on women in other Christian traditions or in Islam. So I believe it is crucial that we understand women's presence and agency in the church and reread and re-examine the history of Orthodox Christianity through a feminist lens. So this volume is a step in this direction, and it is a collective effort to produce new knowledge about women's experiences and roles in Orthodox Christianity, and to try to unsettle this androcentric bias in the study of Orthodoxy. So its starting point is the understanding that the women's question is closely related to the church's engagement with modernity, secularization, gender, cultural, and religious pluralism. So by looking at Orthodox women in different settings, parishes, monasteries, the secular spaces of everyday life, as well as under shifting political conditions and regimes, and by demonstrating that women create new modes of being in the church that navigate the male-centric ecclesiastical powers, the volume contributes, I hope, to an emerging field of study of Orthodox Christianity, and we might want to call this field gendering the ecclesia.
I like that. That's a really nice nice term. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it again in other publications now that you've coined it for us. I love that you mentioned about how so much of the previous work has been focused on the question of women's ordination and orthodoxy, and your book, one of the things that excited me about it when I first read it was that it focused on the lived lives of women, very intersectional way too, from monastic women, lay women, women in digital spaces, and in all these different geographical and linguistic contexts. So it really does help open that space, that very new exploration into what are the majority, if we want to talk about the majority of Orthodox Christians, it's not just the clergy or the hierarchy or the tradition, it's maybe the women participating in the traditions. This is very interesting and rich research that you provide for us. So could you perhaps share with us maybe just 2 or 3 examples that show, you mentioned the range of ways that women engage their religious identities. Not all of our listeners might be familiar with orthodoxy and its relationship to traditional gender roles, and the creative ways women might confound them or use a lot of agency in enacting them, especially since in your book you mentioned that there's this resistance within orthodoxy, even among women, towards feminism or to the term gender equality. So maybe you could share a little bit more, some examples with us.
Okay, let me give perhaps 3 examples of different ways in which Orthodox women engage with their religious identities from the book. And I would like to focus on the issue of feminism, or rather the lack thereof, in a later question, if possible. So basically, I would like to highlight in particular women's contribution to the survival of Orthodox Christianity under communism. When, as I said, state enforced secularization, which marginalized the institutional Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe and repressed public forms of religion. So consequently, women became custodians of religiosity, even though unofficial and unrecognized. And several of the chapters discuss how this confinement of religious practices and beliefs to the domestic sphere gave way possibility for women, particularly elderly women, to start their own ways of fighting for the faith and for conveying religious beliefs and practices to their children and grandchildren. Particularly elderly women continued to attend church on major Christian feasts, continued to prepare at home ritual meals, to pray and to perform domestic religious customs related to birth, death, and marriage. So basically, we can say that women served as the primary, though unofficial and unrecognized guardians of Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. And this is an issue which is not being consistently discussed. And I think the book makes a contribution with discussing this in different Orthodox geographies. So after the fall of the communist regimes, the churches reaffirmed, however, male dominance in the religious sphere, even though this sphere remains highly feminized until today in terms of church attendance, confession, receipt of communion. It is really difficult not to notice a contradiction between the continuous feminization of the Orthodox Christianity and the official male domination of the church. Another important role or vocation for women is monasticism, and it is again an area where women too have for a long time outnumbered men significantly, even though female monastics have remained underrepresented and understudied in the history of the church. So although nuns do not serve in roles that require ordination, they often exercise certain influence, for example, as spiritual mothers or abbesses in prominent convents. While in the past, monasticism provided women with alternative roles to married life, today it provides opportunities for agency, and this is demonstrated in the chapters on Serbia by Milica Bakic-Hayden and on Greece by Eleni Sotiriou. A very interesting case was discussed by Sotiriou in Greece, where the rise of convents with international nuns coming and converting to Greek Orthodoxy has really started to change the face of female monasticism. Unlike the male monastics who remain focused on spiritual pursuits alone, these international nuns convents combine spiritual service with social undertakings, for example, ecological activities, various artistic projects, and in this way they expand the appeal of the convent life beyond spiritual calling. And last but not least, we need to mention women's agency in parish life. Several of the chapters highlight that although women have rather limited official power and standing in the church, because of their professional skills and knowledge, they often play prominent roles on parish level as chanters, choir directors, Sunday school teachers, pilgrimage and church event organizers. And this is leading to a de facto feminization of the parish structures of the church.
That's a observation too about women already being leaders in the church, if not perhaps recognized officially in these official capacities. But I think we definitely see that around the world. And I appreciate your insight too about the monastic communities, drawing on Sotiriou's chapter about nuns being engaged not just in that spiritual life, but in the world. And I think that in some ways maybe mirrors kind of a long-standing, I don't know, maybe maternal kind of observation of women being more active and caring for the world around them. Not that we want to lean into some sort of gender essentialist stereotypes here, but there is, I think, in women's monastic communities and even in the way they care for the church, an activity and an urgency to take care of the religiosity around them, as you mentioned, being maybe custodians for the faith in times of peril. So I'd like to turn now, you mentioned at the end of your introduction, you briefly recount your own episode of kind of evolving your thinking on gender in Orthodox Christianity. And you say on page 11, I wish to believe that transformational thinking and action on important social issues, such as the issue of women's equal rights and status, will one day become the order of the day in Orthodox Christianity. But those transformations need to be cultivated within by women themselves rather than imposed from the outside. I completely agree. And I'd love to hear from you how you think women might cultivate such transformations within Orthodoxy, because this is often a point of contention of other scholars, secular scholars, scholars from other traditions looking at Orthodoxy and seeing something perhaps missing there or wrong, or even women within Orthodoxy saying we need gender equality, but yet it cannot be what we see kind of external to Orthodoxy. It has to be grown from the inside. So share with us maybe your own thoughts about what that process might look like and how it might begin or continue, I guess.
Yes. Basically, the study of women in religion is also a study of women in the larger society. So we need to ask how the shifts in gender relations and sexuality in the wider society, in particular women's emancipation, participation in all spheres of the public life, have the potential to undermine and tacitly transform gender conservative religious practices and norms. However, no doubt that it is difficult for a church which derives much of its identity from a focus on tradition to accept those transformations. So my own experience and many conversations with clergy and lay people in different Orthodox places have confirmed that in Orthodox Christianity we have a continuity of structural patriarchy, and it is often disguised as church tradition. So it is fair to say that women remain marginalized and silenced majority in most of the cases. So they are typically involved in on the edges of formal religious institutions. They typically have restricted religious choices. They are denied teaching positions in theological faculties. In many Orthodox churches, women are never asked even to preach a homily. So to seek ordination is often referred to as a delusion rooted in pride. So even the deaconess's role, as we know, women played in the church until at least the 11th century, still has not been revived, despite important initiatives to do so since 1976. So patriarchy, masculinist God language, androcentrism need to be analyzed in studies of Orthodox Christianity. Those are based on separate and complementary, not equal gender roles and spheres supported by religious teachings about natural differences between the sexes and the validation of women exclusively as mothers. Let's take, for example, the so-called traditional gender values and norms, which typically imply male leadership and female domesticity, right? So those who refuse to see that many lay people are alienated by the church's teaching on gender and sexuality, they just do not pay attention. Yet, paradoxically, we don't have a movement for women's equality in the church, as you mentioned. So one reason, it's a difficult question why we do not have such movement, and I have been thinking a lot about it. And I believe one of the reasons for this, so it's a complex of reasons, but one of these is the quality of theological education in post-communist majority Orthodox countries, which I have experience with. So in many places, theological education continues to be dominated by literalist and conservative teachings, which support the dissemination and internalization of gender discriminatory models. It lacks a critical engagement with sacred texts from female perspective. Importantly, the participation of women in theological knowledge production is minimal. So Western feminist theologies are misrepresented and rejected as deficient and self-indulgent intellectual endeavors by women guilty of the sin of pride. Anti-feminism seems to have become the order of the day even before the emergence of feminist thinking. Consequently, significant sections of women in the church align with conservative teachings of strictly divided gender roles and spheres. However, women are not a homogeneous group. They have diverse, as we know, social, economic, professional, generational profiles, and the contributions in this volume vividly demonstrate this diversity. So even though devout Orthodox women rarely openly challenge gender inequality and patriarchal authority, they often tactically navigate these complex terrains of religious conservatism. And also they negotiate with a considerable level of flexibility the tension between restrictive gender norms and the exigency of everyday life in secularized societies. So by oscillating between conformity to and resistance against unequal gender relations, subjugation to and bargaining with paternalistic masculinities, women both validate and reshape orthodox notions of womanhood. So this is not a straightforward road. So it's a complex and ongoing development. For example, as we saw, the women's expanding activism on parish level challenges traditional gender restrictions and creates conditions for the developing of new ways of understanding and doing theology. Importantly, women's agency transcends this simplistic juxtaposition of compliance versus resistance. And this is very important because in the Western understanding, feminist understanding, as you said, religion is also seen as a major obstacle to women's liberation and women's search for equality. So we have to remember that conservative women abide by different modalities of agency, like submission to God, like performing various nurturing and caretaking acts, and those modalities often are quite at odds with modern feminist understanding of agency as autonomy and resistance to gender conservatism. But they represent agency nonetheless, right? So I believe, in short, that if Orthodox women want empower and inclusion in liturgical and governance processes of the Church, they need to unlearn those internalized patriarchal models and roles and to develop new frameworks of thinking and of being in the Church. This requires a critical mass of critically minded women. We need the development of a genuine Orthodox feminism, if you want, the rethinking of our tradition, church history, and contemporary realities from women's perspectives. And the development of such perspectives to the study of religion constitute, according to German theologian Ursula King, an epistemological and spiritual revolution. So this is a tremendous work which women need to do themselves, and nobody's going to do it for them. So that was my thinking when I said that, yeah, this is possible to change, but it's a long...
a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
Just to follow up on that, in your remarks, you mentioned that this is something women should do themselves, and I so appreciate that, agency that women should have and take an active role in determining kind of what that might look like or how that might happen in particular cultures. But do you see a place for men to also be involved in, I don't know, as allies or supporting that type of movement, or is there just kind of limited room for them because of the kind of structures of patriarchy that mark Orthodox Christianity in so many cultures?
Oh, absolutely. Men are crucial because not only because Orthodox Christianity is a male-dominated religion, but also because patriarchy is not limited to either men or women, and it's more or less a state of mind, right? So in similar way, feminism and struggles for equal rights and equal opportunities is not limited to women, and those are shared lines of activism in which we need to stand together and to struggle together if we really want to change. I mean, the revolution which Ursula King talks about, I mean, epistemological and spiritual, it's revolution nonetheless, and we need revolutionaries, and they are both men and women. I mean, yeah.
Right, we have a question in the Q&A that maybe we'll turn to because it relates to what we're talking about right now. The question is about how faith has always been a part of the culture in which it finds itself. The question of feminism is usually seen as something that comes from outside the church, but how might we also question the original presumptions of patriarchy, women's domesticity, which are from the culture of antiquity, the ancient world, perhaps even Judaism, and even the culture, the various cultures, right, and their heritages that we explore, or you explore in the book.
If I understand the question correctly, yeah, but patriarchy is not only restricted to the boundaries of the church. It's also part of cultural values in many settings, and it needs more than just church feminism or Orthodox feminism. And as I said in my previous response, religion and culture are closely connected, and women bring to the church what they have in society, and also they bring to society what they believe in the church, right? So these are important trajectories which intertwine. So somehow we need to address issues of equality in larger society, and discuss orthodox restrictions, gender restrictive conservative teachings in relation to cultural values and to broader society and to broader legislative and cultural arrangements. And most of East European countries do not have a history of modernity in the real sense of the word, because modernization has been imposed through the communist regimes in a top-down way. So basically these cultural values have been slow to develop, even though under communism we had officially gender parity, because women were had equal voting rights, equal access to education and paid work. So basically one of the arguments why we don't need feminism in Eastern Europe is normally coming from quarters that think that we already have had this equality. So what are we going to need feminism for? Because it's already done. Another argument against feminism in Eastern Europe, at least, is that it comes from outside. It's Western colonial discourse or discursive practice, which is sort of threatening our local traditions and values, and we have our indigenous forms of feminism, but we don't even call it so. Yeah, so the attacks on developing more equal gender just societies are coming from different angles.
We have a question also from one of the contributors to the volume. Sarah Cardy-Swartz asks, how might we engage women who are supportive of conservative patriarchal structures in this movement of Orthodox feminism, while being mindful of their agency and the right to hold these ontological views?
Oh, this is really
it's a big one.
It's a big question. I suggest we have a special panel on this and discuss it probably at the AR or somewhere else, where we would have enough time to develop our thinking on this, because yeah, this is really difficult. But I would repeat that education for me is key, and yeah, at least my own experience and my own way towards the ideas that I define me today, define my thinking on gender equality and women's rights today, it has come from my education and education and probably producing more volumes like this one that unsettles like this androcentric bias in the study of orthodoxy, can bring other women to and men, of course, to think more deeply on these issues and probably transform their, not just their thinking, but their way of doing things and being in the church.
Absolutely. And one of the individuals in the Q&A posted a comment about how those types of changes would affect not just women, but also men, right? Men being perhaps liberated from certain roles and expectations as well. Being a distant father is the example that this person used, perhaps being more active in roles in the home and things like that. So certainly a lot to think about in terms of how shifting gender expectations and roles and values within the church might both transform the culture, work with it, and very personal aspects of people's lives, the home and religious identity. So there's so much rich diversity in the volume, covering it does so many different Orthodox contexts. Maybe you could share with us what for you are the most interesting insights of contributions of the book. I think we could spend all day talking about the path forward or backwards for feminism in the church, and how to respect the autonomy and agency of women that deeply identify with very conservative or traditional gender roles. But maybe now let's turn back to the book for a moment and hear from you what you thought were maybe the most interesting insights coming out of it.
One of the major contribution, I hope, of this volume is that it brings issues of gender to scholars of Orthodox Christianity and scholarship of Orthodox Christianity to scholars of religion. And this is very important because, as we know, studies of religion are often gender blind, while women's and gender studies mostly neglect religion related issues. And when they address real issues, as I already mentioned, it is frequently in through a one-sided critique of the role of religion in sustaining women's suppression. So our volume offers a different angle. It looks at how women inhabit, negotiate, and occasionally resist and subvert conservative religious norms and identities within Orthodox Christianity, both pre-1989 and after 1989. So one of the contribution, for example, looks at this female resistance in the Orthodox Church in Moldova, but in a specific community which challenged, Turkish speaking Gagauz community, an extremely interesting case which engaged in acts of subversion and resistance to Khrushchev's imposed measures of atheism in the 1950s and 1960s in the Soviet Union. So we have these examples of resistance and also work to subvert those either official policies of discrimination against the church or church policies of discrimination with regard to women's restricted roles. So starting from the premise that religion is socially and gender embedded and practiced, the volume makes women's religious experiences visible by exploring them empirically and analytically. And again, it demonstrates that Orthodox Christianity is not a fixed phenomenon, and it is rather a dynamic and changing religious tradition situated in real context. And I think this is the major contribution, if I have to choose among many others.
Thank you. Well, I think that brings us to the just about here to our final minute. I want to make sure to thank you, Ina, for joining us. Thank you for your work in editing this very rich volume that I agree with you sheds so much life and light on women's lives and their experiences from very diverse contexts in a way that attends to intersectionality and all sorts of different ways of engaging religion and our lived experiences in different contexts. So I so appreciate that. Thank you to our listeners for joining us today. I will also do a shameless plug here that Ina's book is on sale, 30% off with Fordham University Press as part of, I think, a holiday sale. So I encourage you to look at Fordham University Press's website to purchase that. And we look forward to bringing you another episode in the series sometime in the beginning of the new year. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. It was an absolute pleasure to be with you today and to discuss all these interesting and important questions.
Thank you, Ina.